Hello everybody and welcome to my session. I guess you're all eager to know what the Rolling Stones, Frank Sinatra and the Lord of the Rings have to do with Lightning components, right? So let's start with one of my favorite songs from the Rolling Stones, Sympathy for the Devil. So please allow to introduce myself. My name is Christian Menzinger. I'm working for a German ISV partner called Apero. We are based in Munich. So here on the right-hand side, you can see our company information and also our GitHub repo, where I have all the demo code I show you in this presentation. It's available in our repo. So yeah, I'm in the Salesforce ecosystem since 3.5 years, doing product development. Probably one point is that I did start using the SOAP API with Salesforce, so that was my first touch point. And right after that, I jumped into Lightning component development. So I missed that classical way of learning Visualforce. So I don't know if this is good or bad, but I like the Lightning Components framework. I'm also leading the developer group in Munich. So if you have some guys around, feel free to join our developer group. Always a pleasure having new faces there. Okay, so when I started working with Lightning Components, I phased out several things, and so this is what I want to share my knowledge with you. So what you can expect today, definitely we want to climb up the hill, so I can give you some ideas how you could leverage the framework to solve a certain issue. So my life as a product developer. So when you start learning Lightning components, you come to that point that you have to call an Apex class. So you have to get data back from Salesforce. So what you normally do is exactly that. So you have a Google search for how you could call an Apex class. So I go to Google and I say, okay, what I have to do for calling a server-side action with Lightning components. And that actually shows up that link here. So it's the first entry in Google. And that brings you to the developer documentation of Lightning components. And when you scroll down a little bit, you will find this template code here. So anyone in the audience has done this Google search and found this template code invoked in an Aura action. So please raise your hands. Awesome. Anyone in the audience who has done this Google search more than once, so twice or more? All the rest of you, you're really genius to remember all this prototyping code here, because I couldn't. And so when you start working, jump back to my slides. So when you start working, you will find exactly this Google search. So, of course, probably you copy and pasted this code, and as I said, probably you did copy and paste the code more than once. So there comes a question to my mind. And so the question is this productional code? So can I just use the snippet and I'm done? So when you have a closer look to that example here, so you will find a lot of things here. So a lot of comments, you will find alerts, something like optionally set, do something here. So obviously this is not productional code. So you have to do some stuff there. And actually that faces one problem, because every developer, so far I know, is a huge Frank Sinatra fan. Because every developer once says, I did it my way. So when you have to implement stuff by yourself, every developer is probably doing it differently. And so you have several developers along your team. You have probably multiple Apex calls you have to do, so different code locations, and you have probably a non-uniform error handling, and also you have to re-Google that code snippet. So these are all problems, especially when you're working in an ISV context as I'm doing. So you have different developers working on the same product, and especially the error handling should be kind of consistent. So if happens something over there, you show an alert. If happens something over there, you show maybe a toast message. So it's not a consistent way of handling this. So that brought me to that idea that I have to solve this problem in a way that we can reuse that code. So different implementation leads to inconsistent behavior. And so I want to get rid of this. So the idea I had is actually what I really need, one ring to rule them all. So that would be bridging the gap between a consistent behavior, so I need one code location, and so the context of my implementation must be independent. So whenever you call a server, you get some data back, and when you're handling the data, obviously you have different data on different server calls. So when you call for contacts and handling contacts, you do something different as you would call for opportunities in your code. So I have to think about how I can solve this problem having this one code location. And of course, I don't want to fiddle around with that template code anymore because I want to get rid of it. Okay, so my next step was exploring actually what changes. So when we had a look at this template code again, so I've marked out several areas, and these are what I would say the essentials of this code. So what we are focusing on, we can focus on the Apex function name. This is the first section here, component get c.serverEcho, because that's the name of the Apex function you want to invoke. So the second part is the parameters you want to pass along with your function call. And the third box here is actually handling the result. So if I want to get rid of this template code and I don't want to copy it from use case to use case, I have to create a more generic approach. So generic means that I don't have any hard-coded dependencies. And so that leads me to that I cannot write directly here c.serverEcho parameters like first name. So these are the hard-coded dependencies. I have to get rid of it. And also handling the result cannot be part of a generic approach. So what I really need is that I have to pass back the data from the server somewhere else, so out of this template code. So one size fits all. That's the question. Is it really that case? So as I said, different server calls leads to different responses, so processing the response cannot be part of a generic approach. This is what I phased out. So also you have the problem that an Apex call is always asynchronous, and also you have to define a callback. This is actually how we can get the data from that asynchronous call, so the data arrives later, you want to get back the data somewhere else where you process your data. So this is what we call a callback. This is probably the hardest part to understand on this construct. Okay, I know from my former Salesforce life, I did a little bit of Java development, so there's one of the object-oriented paradigms that a behavior leads into a method. So the idea that I had is actually I could prototype a helper function and try to make a generic approach of this template code I found at Google. Okay, so this would be the flow I implemented. So you have a Lightning component. Of course, you have a lot of more things in your Lightning components, like you have a GUI and you have a button and you click something and you have a controller. I'm only focusing on these essentials about the server call here in this talk. So I only have the helper scribbled over here. So in my Lightning components helper, I will find a method called getContactList. So that's just from controller invoked, for instance, because you hit a button. So right over there, because I knew that when I want to make a generic approach, I do not directly copy this template code into getContactList, so I create another helper method, and I name it callApex. So what I'm doing is I'm passing information to callApex, and the callApex method is doing the call out to the server. So this is the normal way, so you have an OR action invoking an Apex controller. The method name here is getContactsByFilter, for instance. So this OR action gets returned to the caller, so to my callApex, and now I need this data, what comes back from the server, I need to process it in another helper function, and this is what I named getContactListSuccess. So this would be the flow, passing something to the callApex, and also passing in a callback function that at the end, my data comes back to getContactListSuccess. So that was my first approach solving this problem. And so now we can jump and have a look at the code, how this would be implemented. I copied and pasted this template code from the Google search, put it over here, and I only modified these 3 areas. These are the 3 areas I marked out before, the essentials of that template code. So I need the action, so the method name in the Apex server. So this is done over here in the first red box. So controller method. And as you see, I defined some parameters to this callApex method. So I'm just passing in data, which I'm processing later. So I'm not hard code here the controller method like c.echo, server echo, whatever. So I just pass in controller method and use this variable. So the same I do for the parameters. I do not know what parameters I'm actually sending to the server. I just use an function parameter here and just pass it along with my OR action. So now the hardest part is actually getting the data back. I mean, these are just strings or just an object, this is fine. So the second part is how I can get back the data. And so I have to pass in a callback function reference. So in JavaScript, everything is an object. So you can also just define a parameter of the type, if there would be any types, of the type of a JavaScript function. As you see here, success callback is just a variable name. I do not invoke that method. It's not a method I directly invoke by using the parentheses. I'm just name it. It's just a parameter. And over here in the lower red box, I'm really invoking this method. And so I use this variable name, success callback, and then I invoke the method the normal way you're used to, using parentheses over there, and I'm passing in my response value. So the rest of the code is just the same as from the Google search. So when you look at this code, you don't find any hard-coded dependencies anymore. So at least this call Apex method does not know about the data they're sending along to the server, does not even know about the server name, and it also does not know what data comes back. It's just like a bridge, like a man in the middle. So I have to invoke this method. As you have seen in the scribble in the overflow before, there's get contact list, and then I invoke this method call Apex, just saying this.call Apex, so you can call another helper method. So probably one thing to point out, you should always do your business logic in the helper, not in the controller of Lightning components. And so in the helper, you can also invoke other helper methods or other helper functions. You can't do this in a controller. Okay, so it's always a good practice, business logic in the helper, and so I can use calling other helper functions. So, and you see I pass in all the information for this Apex call, see get contact list by filter, filter string as a parameter, and I pass in the success callback. So this dot get contact list success. As I said, this is just the reference to a function, so I'm not invoking it. There are no parentheses. I just use the definition of this function. And the invocation is over here when I get the response. So the one part is missing is actually just this success callback. It's just a normal function. You can define the parameters as you like because it's your function and you're invoking this function. So component reference and my return value. Now I can really process whatever data you received from your server call. Does that make sense so far? All right. So how far do we get? Is this the solution of the problem? Let's have a look. So call Apex can be reused in a second server call. This is actually cool. So this is what we have implemented or what I have demonstrated in the code. Get contact, call Apex, and get the data back. And I can use the same construct with, for instance, opportunities. So get opportunity list is invoking call Apex. Call Apex is invoking the server-side action. The server-side action is getting back the response, and the call Apex is invoking the success callback. So far, so good. But it's only possible within the same helper, this approach. Okay, so I can, when I have another Lightning component, and probably you have, which is also doing a server invocation, you still have to copy and paste the call Apex method to another place. Okay, also, you only can have one Apex controller per class. So probably if you have like a service layer architecture, probably the one component is dealing with contacts, the other is dealing with opportunities. So there are two different places. So this is not the solution yet. Okay, so I thought about reusability. So in general, what we try to create, or what I try to do is actually I want to have an Apex service. So something which handles all this communication between my client and the server. So how can other components use this abstraction of an Apex service? That is the question. Encapsulate functionality. This is one of the principles. Always encapsulate things into parts. So I know that another from the object-oriented programming languages, when you're talking about classes, so when you go to Wikipedia, a class is an extensible program code template. Okay, that was actually the definition came into my mind. So I had the idea of create an abstract base class where the component can extend from. Okay, so what is an abstract base class? In Java, abstract, or in general, abstract classes are you put some template code there, which you use later on, but you do not directly instantiate. You do not directly use this abstract class. It's more like a template, and then when you create the use case you want to do, then you use this it's kind of a library, just that you have a base class and then you're extending this. So this is a principle of object-oriented programming. So this would make sense, because if I would have call apex in my template class, I can extend multiple classes from it. So that's the idea. Let's see how this would work out. So I have only one helper in my abstract class, because as I said, an abstract class is not instantiated directly, so you do not have to use markup or controller. You just put the stuff in you want to reuse later on. So I put this call apex method here in the helper, in my abstract class. That's the one part. The second part is, whenever I want to use it, I can extend from this abstract class, which is like using this in the background. And so I have the same flow as before. I'm invoking a helper method, and now I call this call apex method, but call apex is no longer part of this Lightning component A helper. It's part of my abstract class in the background, if you so to say. So the workflow is the same. So the call apex is doing the server invocation, I get the data back, and I have a callback. And also the callback here is done directly in the component A helper. So the abstract class is really just having call apex as we had it before. So I could, of course, extend this abstract class on multiple areas. So I can extend a component B, for instance, and I can really reuse that one code over different locations in my code. All right, let's see how this would be implemented. So we first have to define an abstract class in Lightning component. This is really hard. You just define abstract equals true and extensible equals true. That's it. So the only thing which is really kind of strange guy in my eyes is that v.body. So when you're not familiar with that syntax or not directly know what that means, so this is a facet, and at least it's a little bit complicated to explain it right now, so it will be less of time for that. So go for facets and have an investigation over there, because when you extend and you write some markup, your markup will be gone if you forget to add v.body to your component. Just saying. Okay, so v.body is the only thing we have to remember. Abstract equals true, extensible equals true. That's very straightforward. And as I said, I do not have to need implementing a controller because I'm only using the helper. So let's have a look at the helper. I just copy and paste from the previous example my code. I did not touch anything. Just use this call apex method as we created it in the previous step and put it into my component helper. Well, now I have to extend. Also, this is not really hard to do, so you just define your component extends, and then you have to use the full qualified name of your component. So full qualified means you need the namespace and you need the component name. So exactly the same as you would directly create it in markup. So for instance, like Lightning colon button or C, my custom component. So you always have the namespace. If you do not use a namespace in your org, it's always C for custom namespace. That's the default namespace. So that's what I'm here doing. If you would work on a managed package org, for instance, and you have defined a namespace, you would name this with your namespace. But I think also this is very straightforward. So I kept out all the other things, the GUI, as I said before. So I'm extending from this base class, and now I go to the helper, and I exactly use the same code as I had before. I just copy these two methods into this implementation. And so just mention that here there are the other parameters as well, the callback function and so on. I just made it a little bit bigger for readability. Okay, so I have this .callApex and I have my callback function. So the only thing which came to my eyes is I'm calling this .callApex, but it's not there. I can't see it. But this is how inheritance works. So you're just using something having defined in the superclass, in the base class. So I can just call this callApex and it works as before. All right, that looks very promising to me. So how far do we get? So this abstract component I created is generic. I do not have any hard-coded dependencies. So I really can use it on different projects, on different places. So this is a really good starting point. So I can have a generic and reusable approach. So every component can extend from it. Whenever I need an Apex call, I can extend from this base class. So far, so good. So for instance, component A is handling contacts, component B is handling opportunities, component C is nothing handling data, so I don't need to call Apex, so I don't need to extend the base class, and probably have another component. But there is still a problem. One does not simply extend multiple classes. Inheritance is just one-to-one. So you can implement multiple interfaces, but you can only extend from one class. And so sometimes inheritance is already used, so you are extending already from another class. Okay, you can say, if my other class could also extend my base class, maybe, maybe not. So for instance, if you're using a third-party library or you're using a component you have not written, you cannot force the component creator to extend your class. So you won't get into that flow of 1, 1, 1, so extension, extension, extension. And so there is one very good or very important paradigm of object-oriented programming: favor composition over inheritance. Inheritance can be very useful, so we use it also in our product, but think about more when you extend something, you always would say something is something. So for instance, my component is a service component. It is a Apex service component. So where inheritance is very useful is, for instance, if you have, say you create custom buttons with a special behavior and you have 10 of them, you don't want to implement a special behavior in every single button of this 10. So you could create a base class, and then this sentence would make sense because all of my buttons are these special buttons. But what we want to really achieve is we want to have a service component. So we want to achieve something like my component has a service component. It can use a service component because I want to reuse it in several places. So the Lightning Component Framework is designed for composition. That's you do all the day long. When you create markup and you write a button and you write a div and you write whatever, this is composition. You're putting different components together into one container, into one component. That is what composition means. And that's how the framework is designed for. Okay, so let's do the same approach what we tried before with inheritance. Let's do this with composition. So I really create a service component, so a real component, no base class, nothing there, just a real component. And I have the helper with my call Apex class. So far, so good. Now I have another component, and as I said, business logic normally is done in the helper. So now I'm facing the problem that my component A has to invoke the helper of my service component. And this is not possible. You cannot create or you cannot invoke another helper. You can, when you inherit, then you can share the helper, but you cannot invoke another component's helper. So we need the missing piece in the puzzle. And this is actually called ORA method. So normally you always are allowed to use public APIs on another component. For instance, you know all about locker service. Who had already fun with locker service? Okay, some of you. So the locker service prevents you doing, for instance, things what you not own. This is very actually good. It's for security reasons. So that means I cannot invoke another helper's component, helper directly. So I need something which I white flag, I would say. So it's acceptable to do this. And so actually it's you can use a method. So this is actually what is part of the public API. So I define a method over there, then I have the invocation of my helper, and then I have the same event flow as before. So this ORA method is actually the missing piece. And I can, of course, use the service component in as many other components wherever you use this. Okay, so let's jump into code again. So we have to do some small modifications. As I said, it's no more an abstract class. I do not have to extend from it. It's a real component and a real component, so you don't need all the stuff we discussed before. So extensible is true, abstract true, no need for that. Read body, no need for that. So just create an empty component. So the only thing we have to implement is this ORA method. All right, so Our method has also a syntax. Of course, you can find examples in the developer documentation as well. And so you just define the name of the method and you define parameters. So parameters in this case is named with Aura attributes. And as usual, you have to invoke the flow in your Lightning component controller. So you just define an action. So it's the same invocation as you are used to. You have an init handler, so you have a controller action for init, or you push the button, you have a controller invocation for push the button, and now you have a controller invocation for a method call. So that means when I jump to the controller, I always, and that's probably also something strange, I try to add or call a method, but actually I have component event helper as the parameters for my controller method. And that is because the framework is designed that way. It's always these three parameters in controller methods. So how I can get the data from the Aura method when I jump back, here, component, controller method, all this stuff, how I can get it. So I have to use event.getParams.arguments. Yeah, have to remember. I always look it up, but just that's the way it is. So you have to use event.getParams.arguments, and then you have an object, and then you can access all the attributes you defined in the Aura method declaration. So for instance, I have controller method, action parameters, success callback, all the same things we had before, and then I can invoke a helper method by just passing by these information. So now, just one missing thing, because the callback function lives in component A, and I do the invocation in my service component. So I need a reference to come back to that component. So normally you have the component reference, and that's the only reason why I have this variable caller component, that I need the reference to come back to my original component. Otherwise I would lose it, because the component, this component here, is the reference to my service to my service component, exactly. So, but I need a reference to those guy who's calling this actually. Okay, so this is the only thing which is probably strange here. So caller component, I get the reference here and I pass it to my call Apex method. Okay, call Apex has changed, so the same code as before in my helper. So this is now my service component. And now I have to use it. How can I use a component? Just define it in the markup. So that's what I do here. I use an Aura ID that I can reference, and now at one point in my code I want to use this service component. So what I'm doing, component.find, and because I defined an Aura method, I can directly use call Apex here, because that's the name of the Aura method, and passing by all the parameters. Also here, the last two parameters are just cut it off here. So I need component, the filter, the name, the parameters, and my callback. And so the callback would be, again, get contact list success. Does that make sense? More or less. For sure, have to review the code, have to review the flow one or the other time. But yeah, that's the heavy lifting. So we already arrived at the summit. So what we achieved is that we have a real reusable generic service component for every Apex call in our project. So nobody's gonna slow me down. If you have done this once, and it takes some time, it takes some going through, but now you're done. Every developer in your organization can use this component and you can evolve this component. So you can work with them, and for instance, now the real work begins, because as I said in the beginning, like error handling, in the template code we used here, we still don't have a proper error handling. There is still this template code from the developer documentation. So now you can start adding this behavior to your service component. You only have that one code location, and so you can evolve these things. So proper error handling. So for instance, you can add a spinner. So whenever I call a component, so it just shows me the spinner. Or I want to lock the GUI, because sometimes you get into trouble when the user makes too many changes at a time before the data comes back. So probably you want to lock the GUI. And so you could improve your service component just having some parameters or having some attributes that you can configure the service component for this use case. And so that is also what we did. We created this, we involved this in our product, and now we have a solid component. And the only thing a developer in my team, when he's new or another one, and he implements an Aura action call, the only thing he has to remember, we have the service component, and he only needs this one code snippet over here, component find service call Apex and passing by 4 parameters. And he's done. And this is actually what you should do. That's how a component-based framework is going. If you have a certain problem, a certain use case, try to think, is that a use case for a separate component? And so you will build hundreds of components. We really have tons of components because we just put some behavior into that certain single piece of components. Reusable also means documentation. Normally, you should not look into source code to understand what a component is doing, especially if, for instance, your service component is using in a different company. Probably you go to AppExchange, sell that component, whatever. So you need documentation. And so it is always good to at least document everything what is in the public API, public attributes, the events you're firing, and also the methods you're using. So in my experience, when you really create generic and reusable components, it's always more effort at the beginning. So there is no answer to the question, should I always try to make everything generic? It depends. So it's in your responsibility to identify tasks which you see there is a value if I invest that time. Especially in our use case, it's a very simple use case, sorry, but we don't have any GUI. And if you think about, for instance, on SLDS, if you have seen, there are a lot of divs and hierarchies. If you want to make this all configurable from the outside, you have to add an attribute for every style class, every hierarchy. So it's really getting tricky if you build a very complex generic GUI component. But as I said, it really depends if it is worth or not. For this component, calling an Apex service, it's definitely worth because you will do it all the day. And so, as I said, you can really go and involve this component. So, way to go. What's the lessons learned? You have to do now, build more components. So identify recurring tasks in your project. Maybe you have something in mind and you copied and pasted it somewhere. So double check, is it really good copy and pasting, or is it worth investing in a generic component? As I said, you have to ask this yourself. So be generic to be reusable. When you get rid of all the hard-coded things, then the reusability actually increases. As I said, inheritance has it is a little bit strange. It is not the same as you expect when you come from, for instance, Java. So inheritance is really a little bit, take it wisely, I would say. There are good use cases, but try to use composition first before you try to extend something. So favor composition. So yeah, I want to thank you. And I have another slide for all the resources you find. And you can do me one favor, because my company is turning into 10 years next week. So actually it's the mother company, Factory 42. If you would get a loud cheer and say happy birthday, that will be awesome for my company. Thank you very much. Thank you. So if you have any questions, please come over the mic here. And I think we have some more 5 minutes. Yeah, please.
A question, if you're evolving your component to add new options, new parameters, do those Aura attributes support a default value? So your existing code that's using the previous component doesn't need to all change?
Exactly. So what we did in our implementation is that we define everything which I can configurable as attribute. We define default attributes. And what I did is I have a fifth parameter to the call Apex method, which I called caller config. So because sometimes you have a default, but sometimes you want to, just for this one call, I don't want to lock the GUI because I'm just, saving something back or whatever. And so you can always override the defaults with every component invocation. So you can define defaults when you use it, but then for that one invocation, I just override a default, and it's just a object with the same key values as my attributes, and then I check this in the component. So this can be done easily.
Yeah, I noticed that Aura method now can return something, which it couldn't do before.
Say again, sorry?
So Aura method can now return
Yeah,
something
it's a new feature in Winter 18. You can return data, but only synchronous data. When you have an Apex call, it's asynchronous data. And so you need that callback construct, and so you cannot directly return from Aura method.
So, okay, I was wondering, because if you have multiple methods on your helper, if you wanted to expose 50 different methods in your component that's using that service helper, you'd have to have 50 different Aura method statements, right?
No.
How would you expose, so if you have a service helper with lots and lots of different methods you want to expose through the public API, would you not have to have?
You mean if you add some more logic to the service component, not only call
Yes.
Apex? Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
lots of different methods. So
then you have to define it, because that's the only way how you could create an interface, how you use your component, how you invoke something from the outside.
Does the fact that the Aura method can now return something not mean you could return an object with all those methods on it?
Okay. Not quite sure. As I said, you can return from an Aura method directly, but only if it is not asynchronous.
Okay.
If it is asynchronous, in our case, but as I said, if you get to that idea that you have 50 methods, it's probably a better idea to split it up into several components. As I said, think about use cases. Make it smaller and make the smaller ones really bulletproof, and create more components having more bulletproof solutions.
Okay.
Hi. Pretty good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. You mentioned about a few times how far you can go. Right now, promises in the Java in the front-end development is gonna become very popular versus callback functions. Can you go further? Say the helper, the service component, instead of pass in a callback function, and it return the promise. So, and the caller, at the client point of view, you can chain, say, multiple promises and then into a process in the pipeline.
I've not done this. Probably one thing I'm facing out is that sometimes the context of the caller component changes. So what you can do, of course, when you do call Apex and passing by the component reference, you can use bind this to really get the context back to that original component. So I'm not sure exactly in the promises context how this works if you have changes. But I have seen Christoph here in the room before, so for sure he can answer your question. I don't know if he's gone, but I think he has a following up talk. So Christoph Conrads, if you know him, I mean, he for sure can answer this question.
Okay, maybe you can give me his contacts.
He must show up because he has the next talk. So.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.